Okay, so when you think Roman gladiator, what pops into your head? Probably some kind of hero, right? A slave fighting for his freedom, like in the movies. But what if I told you that's, well, mostly a myth? The real story of who these fighters were and why they stepped onto that sand is so much more complex and, honestly, way more surprising. Let's dig in. So what's the deal? Were they slaves, criminals, superstars? The wild answer is, yeah, all of the above. A gladiator's life was this complete paradox. They were literally at the bottom of the barrel in Roman society, but at the same time, they were the biggest celebrities of their day. I mean, how does that even work? That's the puzzle we're going to piece together. Let's start with the basics, right? The word itself. Gladiator comes from gladius, which was the iconic Roman short sword. So a gladiator is a swordsman. Simple. But that very simple name hides a brutal, thousand-year history that had very little to do with just simple sword fights. To really get the gladiator, we have to go back to the very beginning. And it doesn't start with entertainment or a big show. It starts with death. The very first recorded games, way back in 264 BC, they weren't for the public at all. They were a munus, a private religious duty to honor a dead nobleman. But people loved it, and their popularity just exploded. So much so that by 105 BC, the government basically took over, turning them into this massive public show. And for centuries, this was the biggest show in the empire. It lasted for almost 1,000 years before it was finally banned. 1,000 years! This little snippet from the historian Livy gives us a huge clue about what was going on. He mentions that one group, the Campanians, dressed up their gladiators as Samnites, who were an old enemy Rome had conquered. See what's happening? This wasn't just a random costume choice. The games were becoming a kind of living history, a way for Rome to constantly relive and celebrate its military victories, making its defeated enemies play their parts over and over again. And, of course, wherever you have a massive crowd, you're going to have politics. Ambitious Romans figured out really fast that sponsoring the most spectacular, most bloody games was the absolute best way to get popular and win votes. Get this, Julius Caesar threw this insane festival for his father, who had been dead for 20 years. It was pure political grandstanding. It got so out of hand that the Senate had to pass laws to limit how many gladiators one person could own, because they were terrified these so-called entertainers could be turned into a private army. So we're starting to get the why behind the games. But what about the who? What was it actually like to be a gladiator? Let's go behind the scenes, inside the schools, and find out what their daily life was really like. Now, you probably assume at every gladiator was a slave or a criminal, and yeah, a lot of them were. These were the damnati, the condemned, sentenced to fight as their punishment. But here's the part that might just blow your mind. Historians think that maybe half of all gladiators were actually volunteers, free men called octorati who willingly signed a contract, basically trading their freedom and legal rights for a shot at fame and, more importantly, a whole lot of money. It was the ultimate high-risk, high-reward career. And their lifestyle was just full of these crazy contradictions. For one, their diet was mostly vegetarian, tons of barley and beans for energy. It even earned them the nickname hordieri, which means the barley eaters. And they got top-notch medical care because, let's be honest, they were an incredibly expensive investment for their owners. They even had unions, collegia, that made sure they got a proper burial and that their families got a pension. They were property, for sure, but they were prize property, all of them bound by that terrifying oath, to accept being burned, bound, beaten, and killed without complaint. And this right here, this gets us to the absolute core of the gladiator paradox. Under Roman law, they were classified as infames, disgraced, dishonorable. They had no legal rights, couldn't vote, couldn't write a will. They were on the same social level as prostitutes and actors. And yet, they were total rock stars. We have graffiti from Pompeii that calls one gladiator the glory of the girls. So legally, they were nothing. But culturally, they were everything. All right, that brings us to the arena itself, the Colosseum. What actually happened out there on the sand? Well, I'll tell you this, it was a lot more structured than the chaotic brawls you see in the movies. A day at the Games was a full-day affair. It would kick off with a huge parade, the Pampa. Then the morning was for the Venetines, these wild beast hunts with lions, bears, you name it. The middle of the day took a really grim turn with public executions of criminals. So the main event, the actual one-on-one gladiator fights, that didn't even start until late in the afternoon. And the fights themselves, they were not random slugfests. Oh no, they were highly strategic matchups. Take the classic pairing. A retiarius, the netman, versus a secutor, the pursuer. It is a perfect clash of styles, speed versus power. The retiarius is fast, lightly armored, trying to trap his opponent with a net. The secutor is a tank, heavily armored, slow, just trying to get in close for one good sword thrust. These guys weren't just brutes. They were highly skilled athletes with specific game plans. So what about the famous thumbs down thing? Well, the reality was a bit more complicated. A defeated gladiator, if he was still alive, could appeal for mercy just by raising a finger. Now, the final decision to grant missio, or a pardon, was up to the guy sponsoring the games. But he was always watching the crowd. If a gladiator fought well and bravely, even in defeat, the crowd would often roar for him to be spared. Death wasn't always the automatic outcome. But no matter how skilled you were, no matter how much the crowd loved you, death was a constant presence. So what was the ultimate fate for these fighters and for the bloody games that defined their lives? Archaeologists who have studied gladiator cemeteries have given us one single, really stark number: 27. That was the average age a gladiator died. And remember, those are the ones who are successful enough to even get a proper burial and headstone. It was a brutal, and very short life. And yet, they weren't just faceless victims. This epitaph from a real gladiator's tomb is just so incredibly human. Victor, he wants everyone to know that fate killed him, not that his opponent was better. And he's so proud that his friend, his brother-in-arms, Polynicus, went out and avenged him. It just shows you this whole world of pride and friendship and honor that existed even in the face of certain death. So why did it all stop? After 1,000 years, why did the games end? It was basically a 1-2 punch. First, you have the rise of Christianity, which, for obvious reasons, condemned the games as a form of pagan human sacrifice. And at the same time, the Roman Empire was going broke. These spectacles were unbelievably expensive to put on, and as the economy crumbled, the will to keep them going, both morally and financially, just kind of evaporated. So that leaves us with the big question. What were the games, really? They started out as a religious ritual for the dead. Then they morphed into a powerful political tool. And finally, they became the ultimate and most brutal spectator sport in history. The truth is, they were all of those things at once. The gladiator is still one of history's most fascinating figures because he stands right at the intersection of it all: life and death, religion and politics, shame and glory.